This is the first of two lectures on the book of Joshua, a book that deals with the conquest and partitioning of the land. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle. Now, as far as the backdrop of Joshua, we don't know who the author was. Critical scholars call him the Deuteronomist. It was not written by Joshua, even though Joshua is the main character of the book. The date is sometime after Joshua. You have an expression that's used a number of times that these things are still true, quote, to this day. And it suggests that some time, quite a bit of time, has passed since the events recorded. The title is named after the main character, Joshua. Joshua in Hebrew, Yahushua, means the Lord is salvation. Now, the name Jesus and Joshua are interconnected. Jesus is actually a shortened form of the name Joshua. So the longer form is Yahushua, but the short form of it is Yeshua. Yeshua is simply Jesus. The older Greek versions render Joshua with the Greek word Iesus, which is the same as the New Testament Greek word for Jesus. And that allows a wordplay to be made. Now note there's a wordplay in Matthew 1:21. You are to give him the name Jesus, Yeshua, because he will save his people from their sins. And Jesus is a shortened form of Joshua, which means the Lord is salvation. His name will be, quote, the Lord is salvation because he will save his people from their sins. A little bit of the literary setting of Joshua. The narrative setting is continuing the story of the Exodus right after Moses dies in Deuteronomy chapter 34. The canonical setting is now we have moved on to the book of the prophets. The Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible is divided up into law, prophets, and writings. And Joshua is the first book of the prophets, or more specifically, what are called the former prophets. The latter prophets are more the prophets that we would think of as prophets, but some of these historical books were considered to have been written by prophets and therefore are called prophets as well. Critical scholars adopt a view by Martin Note called the Deuteronomistic history hypothesis. Martin Note was a German critical scholar. In 1943, he coined this term Deuteronomistic history. He argued that Deuteronomy is not so much the conclusion of the Pentateuch as the introduction to the historical books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. The author of the whole is the Deuteronomist, the DTR, who wrote during the Babylonian exile, according to Note. The Deuteronomistic history, DH, is a modern theoretical construct which holds that the books of Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings constitute a single work. Now, the key term here is modern. No ancient authors or anyone else before Note argued this, and yet it has been widely accepted among critical scholarship. According to Note, Deuteronomy through Kings, though not Ruth, is one literary unit. And these books are based on Deuteronomy's theology, especially found in Deuteronomy 28, that if you obey God, you will be blessed, and if you disobey God, you will be cursed. Now, there are some positive elements of his theory. There is clear influence of Deuteronomy's theology in Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Indeed, when they obeyed God, they were blessed, and when they disobeyed God, they were cursed. And Kings clearly dates into the exile, as the very last chapter indicates. On the other hand, it's not clear that a single author wrote Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. There seems to be stylistic differences between, say, Joshua and Judges and Samuel. and even Samuel and Kings. Could be many authors and editors over time. And so it's not clear that it originally constituted a literary unit. In other words, something like Joshua and Judges and Samuel may have existed even before the exile. Well, what's the general purpose of Joshua? The general purpose is to show how God began to fulfill the promise of land given to the patriarchs back in Genesis. Genesis 12 and verses 1 through 3, and also 15, 18 through 20, promised them the land. And finally, they begin to occupy the land. Outline of Joshua, the first 12 chapters describe the conquest of the land of Canaan. Chapters 13 through 21, they divide up the land among the tribes, at least in principle. And then in Joshua 22 through 24, Joshua gives a farewell speech, exhorts the people, and renews the covenant with them at Shechem. So let's go through the content of the book in a brief sort of way. Chapters 1 through 12 describes the conquest. It begins this way: Moses, my servant, is dead. Then you, speaking to Joshua, and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I'm about to give them to the Israelites. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, I will be with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not let this book of the law depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged. For the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. This describes the call of Joshua to be Moses' successor. Joshua replaced Moses as Israel's leader. Joshua was exhorted to follow God's law in order to be blessed. And God repeats Deuteronomy 31 and verse 8's exhortation not to fear or to be dismayed, for God was going to be with them. Now, why was it that Joshua was chosen to be the successor? Well, there's at least two things that come to mind. He had the experience for it. He had served as the attendant of Moses all the way back to Mount Sinai when he went up to the mountain part way, Mount Sinai, when Moses went up to receive the law. He was also a man of faith. At Kadesh Barnea, he, along with Caleb, had given the minority report that trusted in God to overcome great enemies. And so his experience and his faith made him a good person to succeed Moses. Now, in Joshua chapter 2, they sent spies to check out Jericho. Now, the spies stayed at a brothel of a woman by the name of Rahab the prostitute. And Rahab had heard of what God had done for the Israelites, especially in the Transjordan, defeating the Transjordan kings there. And so she chose to side with the spies. And Rahab was promised salvation. She requested and received assurance that when the battle of Jericho came, that she would be spared in that battle. Then in chapters 3 through 5, the ark crosses the Jordan River. It actually looks like it crosses it several times, but there's a bit of resumptive repetition where the same story is told repeatedly. But anyway, the Jordan River stopped up so that people could cross over on a mostly dry creek bed. And in order to, again, renew the covenant, all the men who had not been circumcised were circumcised. Apparently some had neglected that practice. And it was kind of like the parting of the Red Sea. That statement in Joshua 1 and verse 5, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. Well, just as God through Moses parted the Red Sea, so God through Joshua stops up the Jordan River so that they could cross over on dry land. And then we begin the description of the conquest, which takes place in 3 phases. You have a central campaign where they cross over and take Jericho and Ai and go on actually up to Shechem, that central area. But then you have a southern campaign where they go to the south and they take the territory that's later going to be called Judah all the way to Hebron and over to Gaza. They encounter the Gibeonites on that particular segment of their campaign. And then there is a northern campaign where they go up all the way to Hatzor, north of the Sea of Galilee. Well, you start off with the central campaign in chapter 6 through 8, where they will go to Gilgal and again renew the covenant and practice circumcision. They will take Jericho and they will take Ai. In chapter 6, Jericho is taken. The army marched around the city for 6 days, and then on the 7th blew the trumpets, and miraculously the walls fell down, and this allowed Israel to take that city. And all the inhabitants were killed except for Rahab, who was spared as promised by the spies. And then in chapter 7, they suffered a defeat at the city of Ai. Unexpectedly, they lose the battle at Ai. It turns out that a man by the name of Achan had taken things that were under the ban, that is, were dedicated to God. So God was not blessing them because they disobeyed. Sin in the camp meant that God could not bless them. So they took care of Achan and his family that were in cahoots with the hiding of the treasures and executed him. And then they were able to take the city of Ai. They did that in chapter 8. And then they went up to Shechem, where they renewed the covenant at Mount Ebal. They built an altar at Shechem, just as had been commanded in Deuteronomy chapter 27. The next phase was to the south, where they went into the territory of what came to be Judah. The Gibeonites were encountered there. The Gibeonites made a peace treaty with Joshua, and so they were not destroyed. They pretended to be non-Canaanites who had traveled from afar to meet with Joshua. They were Canaanites, the people commanded by God to be completely driven out. And unfortunately, Joshua had not checked out their credentials, and he did not consult the Lord before he made the treaty with the Gibeonites. Nonetheless, the Lord told him to honor his agreement because he had sworn in the name of the Lord not to harm them. So that's how the Gibeonites came to be spared in the conquest. Now, it was with the Gibeonites that you have this rather unusual event, Joshua's long day, where it says that the sun stood still. In Joshua 10, verse 12, on that day the Lord gave the Amorites over to Israel. Joshua said to the Lord in the presence of Israel, O sun, stand still over Gibeon. O moon, over the valley of Aijalon. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped, till the nation avenged itself on its enemies, as it is written in the book of Jasher. The sun stopped in the middle of the sky and delayed going down for about a full day. There has never been a day like it before or since, a day when the Lord listened to a man. Now, explaining this long day of Joshua has been a bit of a challenge. You might, by the way, have heard a rumor that Joshua's long day was found by NASA scientists. Unfortunately, this is an urban legend without any factual basis. But what's the nature of Joshua's long day? And there's several different interpretations. One is that it could be a pure miracle, that God stopped the earth's rotation, and that would be a stupendous miracle, so that the sun stood still. And he would have had to take other measures to keep, if you stopped the earth from rotating, we'd be traveling at high speeds. So he would have to balance all that out as well. Anyway, it could be a pure miracle of that sort. Others say, well, it's some sort of cosmic event that caused a refraction of light, so that the light stayed in the sky for an extended day, but it wasn't the earth quit turning. It's the light was refracted so that it continued to shine. Or maybe some other cosmic event added to the light. So that's another explanation of it. Yet a third explanation is that perhaps the language is poetry. The quote is from the book of Jasher, and the book of Jasher seems to be a poetic book, in which case it could be the hyperbole of poetry. It was as if the day were extended, and the day stood still. The word still could also be translated silence, and might refer maybe even to an eclipse that kept things cool so that the men had the strength to continue fighting. So there's been a lot of discussion and debate over the nature of Joshua's long day. I can't resolve that particular issue, but these are the common theories. Well, when we get to Joshua chapter 11, then we get to the northern campaign, the third campaign that goes all the way up to Hatzor, north of the Sea of Galilee, where they defeat Jabin, king of Hatzor. And then finally, having conquered in the north and the central part and the south, it lists all the kings that were defeated: Jericho and Ai and Jerusalem and Hebron, and so on and so forth. 31 kings in all that were defeated by the Israelite armies. And then in chapters 13 through 21, they divide up the land among the tribes. And each tribe is given territory. And 2.5 tribes, the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, had asked to be allowed to stay to the east of the Jordan River, land that's technically not a part of the Promised Land. And so half of the tribe of Manasseh and the tribe of Gad and the tribe of Reuben ended up outside of the land of promise. But the general theology of this section is that God had kept his promise. He had allowed them to conquer the land given to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob so many years ago, which was only a promise but not yet at all fulfilled. Now it was substantially fulfilled. The last part of the book, chapters 22 through 24, gives Joshua's farewell and covenant renewal with the nation as a whole. In chapter 22, the Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh asked to possess the land that had been conquered east of the Jordan River. As you might recall from our lecture on Numbers, that because the Transjordan countries had attacked Israel and they counterattacked and defeated Sihon and Og and took their territory, they ended up conquering land that was outside of the Promised Land. And Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh said, we can settle there, and that'll give you more land for the other tribes to settle in within the Promised Land. And so these 2.5 tribes settled in the Transjordan, although there was a controversy over an altar they built there that the other tribes first saw as a rebellion against the tabernacle's altar. Then in chapter 23, Joshua exhorts the leaders. This is towards the end of Joshua's life. He encouraged the leaders of Israel to remain faithful to God. He told them, be very strong, be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses without turning aside to the right or to the left, Do not associate with these nations that remain among you. Do not invoke the name of their gods or swear by them. You must not serve them or bow down to them, but you are to hold fast to the Lord your God as you have until now. And then in Joshua chapter 24, there is Joshua's final farewell speech, where he calls on the nation to renew its covenant with God at the city of Shechem. And this is in response to the blessings having been given, the blessing of the land, which is part of that covenant. And the people eagerly comply with this call for covenant renewal. Part of the lines there, then Joshua assembled all the tribes of Israel at Shechem. Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods of that your forefathers worshipped beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourself this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of your forefathers, which they served beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Well, let's talk about some of the theological themes in the book of Joshua. There's the theme of God's promise of the land. God keeps his promise, just as he promised the patriarchs, as it mentions in chapter 1 and verse 6. He gave them the land, and now they begin to occupy the land God had promised so many centuries before. There's a bit of typology here. The land is a foreshadowing of heaven. God has promised an inheritance to us, reserved in heaven for you, as it says in 1 Peter 1, verses 3 through 6. And that word inheritance is using the language of Joshua. God gave them an inheritance, the promised land. God has given us an inheritance, the promise of inheritance in heaven. Then there's the theme of God's rest. God promised repeatedly that he would give the people rest. Joshua 1:13, 1:15, and then in chapters 14 and 21 and 22 and 23, that in the land, once they defeated their enemies, there would be rest. Again, there's typology here. Hebrews 4:8 indicates that this anticipates typologically a far greater rest. Joshua's namesake, Jesus, gives the true rest, the rest of salvation. And this is elaborated on in Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, that sees in the rest that was promised to Joshua a foreshadowing of the rest that is provided by Yeshua, Jesus. And then there's the covenant and covenant blessings and cursings. Joshua is exhorted to obey the covenant stipulations in order that he could have success, chapter 1 and verse 8. The ark, the symbol of that covenant, plays a prominent role in the narrative, especially in chapters 3, 4, and 6. And the Achan incident shows that when they violate the covenant, this leads to judgment and failure, disaster, defeat at the city of Ai, chapter 7, verse 11 and verse 15. But then there's covenant renewal in chapter 8 and also in chapter 24. And similarly, we must obey God's commandments to have success. And periodically, it's good for us to renew our covenant relationship with God. Another theme of the book of Joshua is the holiness of God. God shows himself to be a holy warrior, and God's holiness is seen in the wiping out of the Canaanites. There's always a danger for us to have an overly sentimental view of God, that God's a God of love, and forget the fact that God is also a God of holiness. And in his holiness, he's also a God of judgment and must punish the wicked. And we see that in his judgment of wiping out the Canaanites. God appears in this book as a warrior in the person of the angel of the Lord. He was portrayed as the captain of the troops. And again, there's a typology here as well, an eschatological holy war. In the destruction of the Canaanites is a foreshadowing of the ultimate judgment at the end of the age, when Christ will come on a great white steed as a warrior leading the armies to defeat the Antichrist and the devil. Likewise, the people were to exhibit holiness. Joshua demanded God's people to be holy by observing the sign of the covenant, circumcision, chapter 5, 2 through 9. This could be compared with baptism for Christians. He also commanded them to observe Israel's distinctive feasts like Passover. For us, we could compare that with the Lord's Supper. And lack of holiness could mean punishment. When Israel, and not just Achan, sinned, God could no longer bless them, chapter 7 and verse 11. They had to be disciplined, and they had to discipline the worst offender, chapter 7, 25 and 26. And even in the New Testament commands church discipline from time to time. We also see heroes of faith in the book of Joshua. Joshua himself is a hero of faith. In the famous faith chapter of Hebrews chapter 11, it says, "By faith the walls of Jericho fell down after they had been encircled 7 days." Of course, Joshua led the army in that event. Joshua's character was a good character. He was a new Moses. He was a keeper of the law. He showed courage in war. He met with God on holy ground where he had to remove his shoes, kind of like Moses in Exodus 3 and verse 5. Joshua did the same thing in Joshua 5 and verse 15. We also have another hero of faith, which is Rahab. By faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she had welcomed the spies in peace. Hebrews 11 and verse 31. And similarly, in James chapter 2 and verse 25, was not Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction? James uses this to show that she showed her faith by her works. So this is the major themes of the book of Joshua. But in the coming lecture, we will discuss some of the problems that are in the book of Joshua.